Thank you. Good evening to everyone. This is the October 19th session of the public hearing with respect to the Canton Avenue 40B project. I guess tonight, what my understanding was, we were here in significant part is the progress, if any, that's been made in the various meetings that have taken place between consultants for the applicant and consultants for neighbors and various citizens in the town of Milton. And in addition to getting something of a progress report, maybe a discussion of what further meetings might take place in an effort to improve the project and come up with a set of conditions that seems to ameliorate many of the issues and concerns that we've heard about over the last few weeks. So that was my understanding of what would take place then. Before we get to that, I just wanted to note that the board has received certain communications since our last public hearing, all of which will be part of the record. But the first and perhaps most important was a communication that we received through Tim Zawinski from the fire chief, who indicated clearly that without a secondary access over Mergewood Drive, I hope I have that right, that it would not be a safe project in terms of fire safety. So that secondary access, at least in the fire chief's mind, is really critical with respect to the proposed development. We've also received a fairly lengthy memo prepared by an abutter, Ken Roach, regarding various construction issues relating to the plan, and it goes into some considerable detail. And that was addressed to all the members of the board, and again, as part of the record, and perhaps there'll be some discussion about that either tonight or later as we begin to wind this down. And then we also received a communication early on, back around October 4th or 5th, that related to a working session that had been held on Monday, October 4th, and comments or whatever that was made in the context of that working session between the various professionals that have been engaged to look at some of the issues associated with this proposed development. So I think it's important that everyone know that we have those communications, and certainly the board members are all aware of those communications and the substance of those communications. So with that preface, I guess I would turn to Jesse Schomer to sort of give us an update on where at least he sees things stand in terms of progress, resulting from the various meetings of consultants, and what he would suggest going forward in terms of additional meetings and scheduling on a more sort of global plane. So, Mr. Schomer, if you could just kind of update us on where we are.
Certainly. Good evening, Chairman Hurley and members of the board. As you're aware, the applicant's consultants met with the board's peer reviewers back on October the 4th, and in a Zoom working session to go over some of the peer reviewers' recommendations regarding the project revisions. That meeting was also attended by consultants of Attorney Corcoran, as well as by Judy Barrett and Tim Zawinski from the town. We have our architect from Embark Architecture. It looks like they're still in the attendees list, but we have a progress report that we would like to present to the board briefly with some proposed modifications of the plans to incorporate some of the requests for revisions from the peer reviewers. And then following that, we would propose to perhaps after the meeting schedule a follow-up working session with Judy Barrett and with the town's peer reviewers. So I can report that the meeting did take place. We have been working since that meeting to try to incorporate some of their revisions and commentary on the site access issues that came up, and those were also discussed with the fire chief at a meeting. I believe it was last week with him and the town planner, Tim Zawinski. If it pleased the board, Chairman Hurley, I would turn it over to Tim Loringer from Embark Architecture to go through this revision, which we've not filed this previously. This is just a draft at this point to show you a progress report, as it were. But we would, of course, file this with the board formally in the morning to make sure that this is available for anyone who's interested in the status of this as the process moves forward.
That would be fine, but just before we get there, do I understand that you think that a further working session will be necessary going forward?
I would think it would be helpful to get a sense from the peer reviewers regarding their reaction to this proposal and whether it would resolve most, if not all, of their concerns. We think it would, but we would want to get confirmation from them before we formalize this and make formal changes to the plans for resubmission to the board.
And it makes sense to me that you would have that for the working session, but we can talk about that a little bit later on. So sure, why don't you have your consultant make the presentation?
Okay, but it'll be brief. The changes are not major changes, but I think they're important ones.
Okay.
Thank you, Jesse. Good evening, Chairman, members of the board, members of the public. To Jesse's point, I don't know if I characterize them not major changes, but they're certainly not, we haven't fully gone through taking it all the way to its conclusion at this point. We just kind of wanted to show where we are at the moment and kind of direction we plan on going in. So it's just, I have a couple bullet points and then just a revised site plan to show here. It's not really like a full presentation. So let me share my screen. Will it allow me to? All right, does everyone have that now? So between the initial feedback we heard from the peer review reports, comments from the public, additional comments we got from the public at the site walk we attended a couple weeks ago, and then the further detail we went into both at the working session with the peer reviewers and the meeting with the fire chief. There were a few major takeaways that we kind of took from that regarding transportation on site, kind of how the buildings were organized, how the open space was organized. And we feel like there were a few major points that we felt we could kind of move in to address some of those concerns while also keeping the kind of the architectural character and nature scale of the concept similar to where it was, because we think that direction was something that the change we had made from the previous scheme toward that kind of smaller, finer grain architectural scale was something that the neighbors and the abutters and the board wanted to see. So we wanted to kind of keep that character while also addressing some of these other concerns. So the first thing we did was connect two of the parking ends to create a loop internal to the site so that emergency vehicles can egress the site without using the connection to Mergewood. They can, the fire chief express a preference to keep all egress internal to the site and express that Mergewood connection would, he wanted to maintain it, but only in the event of secondary access. So having that internal loop would allow them to to access and egress the site primarily internally without having to reverse direction, which was their preference. It would also just make it easier to navigate for your everyday vehicle traffic, passenger traffic, and delivery vehicles or garbage pickup without anyone having to reverse direction or back up, which was a safety concern that came up, and it eliminated most of the dead end parking runs, but again, eliminated the need to reverse direction or make it easier to navigate the site. We also were able to consolidate a couple of the buildings, which is something that came up in the architectural peer review, which has reduced the overall building footprint. So we did gain some area of roadway by connecting those two vehicle parking dead ends, but we were able to offset that by consolidating some building footprint, and we actually we reduced the amount of net impervious surface through these revisions. And then we were able to take one of the 3-story buildings that was kind of at the end of the site adjacent to 652 Canton and reduce that to a second 2-story building. So anywhere, all of the 3-story buildings down the site are kind of really contained to the center of the site. We're able to kind of increase the amount of setback from the buildings to some of the abutters as well at different areas of the site with this consolidation. Another thing we did was relocate the amenity clubhouse to the north side of the road. So it is now adjacent to those specimen trees in that area we were kind of showing as the play area. So that allowed us to kind of increase the buffer we have to those trees and also flatten the, kind of straighten out the access road a bit so that we kind of tightened up everything to the north and south of that road and created additional buffer to along the stream, the south of the site, in addition to those trees to the north. And then we generally reorganized the open space, which is another thing that came up in the architecture peer review. So all of it now is kind of centered around the amenity clubhouse at that north corner of the site. And the areas, kind of the interstitial spaces between the buildings have not only grown a little bit as we consolidated some of the buildings, but it's much more private space now. It's not really as much of a network of the connected spaces, but kind of a centralized spot for those programmed open spaces. And then everything else is just kind of more private. So let me just to remind everyone, here's where we were previously. Kind of amenity clubhouse right at the entrance, townhouses flanking this kind of more winding entry road, and then a series of 2- and 3-story stack flat buildings that were kind of pinwheeling around these dead end parking corridors. So here is the current plan. Now, again, this is just a draft. We wanted to kind of get the board's feedback, get the public's feedback, have another working session before we kind of took this any further. But the major changes we made here are connecting that parking loop to create the internal vehicle loop, creating one larger building here at the center, which is 3 stories, but is still a stack flat typology. That's something that was important to the client, and something that we think would be more beneficial and to the eventual end users or residents of the site, having that maintaining that private unit entries as much as we could wherever we could. And the benefit of the stack flat type over the townhouses is that all of the ground floor units would be fully accessible, whereas any of the townhouses obviously are not. So then, as I noted, building 8 remains the same. Building 9 here went from a 3-story to a 2-story. So now everything along the border here with 652 Canton is 2 stories. And then we were able to, as I said, flatten out the entry drive here. We went from a buffer for the property line to the rear of these townhouses of just under 20 feet to approximately 25 feet now. The amenity clubhouse and patio adjacent to it is no longer directly adjacent to the abutter here. It's now across the street, and we've increased the setback from the specimen trees that we'd like to maintain, preserve, and kind of use as the focal point and center point of this new kind of consolidated programmed open space that kind of feeds off the amenity clubhouse and the patio area adjacent to it. So that is the one other final change we made here is we had a single loaded parking corridor at this portion of the site, and we've now created that a double loaded parking to more evenly distribute the parking around the site while maintaining the exact same parking count and ratio. And it also allowed us to, the townhouse type here will allow us to ease the grading a bit more at this portion where previously we had a bit of a steep grade so you could get circulation around that stack flat building. It is now just townhouses here. So that former lawn space here that kind of culminates at the end of this parking drive is now kind of one of the comments from the architectural peer review was that it was an awkward public space that kind of related too closely to the units and semi-private, semi-public. So with the main kind of lawn, recreation, patio area kind of being around the clubhouse now, that's much more of a private space for those buildings that's larger than the interstitial spaces we previously had between the buildings. So we can program it to be kind of this the private outdoor space that directly feeds off of these private unit entries to these stack flat buildings. So something that I think would be very desirable to the end users. So that's the main changes we've made. So we haven't worked through the changes to the I don't want to speak for what that would be, but we haven't worked through the changes to the stormwater plan or the grading yet, or work through the architecture of the buildings completely. The direction is to kind of maintain the same architectural character that we previously had in the 3-story building in this newer, larger one, but to make sure that we're keeping the kind of rendering of the facade as at the same kind of finer scale that the other buildings are at. for this to not feel like a large multifamily building, but have that same kind of play that the townhouses and the other stack flats we kind of already showed in the previous renderings have. So I don't know if do you want to add anything to that, Jesse, or?
No, thank you, Tim. Turn it back over to the board members in case you have any questions. But in a nutshell, this is where we are in terms of our progress, and obviously there are some meaningful changes here, and we'd like to have an opportunity now to speak with Cliff Bomer and Sean Reardon again to get their sense of this plan and whether this resolves the issues that they had raised, as well as those of the fire chief from our meeting with him last week.
One more thing I will add too, as it ties into that the additional potential working session, is that we haven't fully worked through exactly how vehicle drop off or dumpster locations will work yet. I think we still want to kind of speak with that internally and with the peer reviewers. But as you can kind of see, just kind of looking at the parking layout here and the road layout, just briefly, there's much more opportunity to kind of accommodate those things than there were in the previous plan. Where we are showing a loading zone and dedicated parking and handicap parking directly in front of the clubhouse. We're showing another loading zone directly in front of the largest building. And we have several locations we've called out for kind of potential dumpster locations and trash pickup that I think work better than where we were previously. So these aren't necessarily the exact spots these are all going to end up, but we definitely have a lot more. This is a much more like fungible the way we can kind of work through this. There's a lot more opportunity for those kind of utilitarian functions.
Do I understand that the Mergewood Drive emergency access will still be involved, and that the fire chief, in effect, wants to have that as an emergency backup access to the site?
Yes. So the kind of based on our meeting with him, his thoughts were in terms of priority of like how they would approach a site like this is they want to keep all access and egress internal to the site as much as they can. So they will use, anytime they come to the site, they will use the internal loop to kind of come in and exit. What they don't like to do is back up. And while the T-turn of the previous plan worked and they could do it, they would rather not. So they may have used that as this access point as egress at that point, but they'd rather not. So providing the internal loop where they don't have to back up, they will almost always come in, turn around, and exit the site the same way they came in. This point of access they would use as a secondary point of access. So it would rarely, if ever, be used. So it wouldn't be part of their general egress plan anytime they came to the site. It would really only be used if they couldn't access through the main access point off of Canton Ave.
So it would be very much a secondary emergency.
Very much secondary access and not in
now, in the course of the meetings or meeting, has there been discussion about groundwater and surface water issues?
That I can answer that, Chairman Hurley. That did come up during the peer review working session with Sean Reardon, and I believe that we're working through those issues with our consultants from Allen and Major, and I know he's on the meeting here. His name is Phil Cordero. He looks like he's in the attendees list as well. We're also working on bids for the groundwater mounding analysis that was previously discussed with the board, and that was requested by Sean Reardon as well as Attorney Corcoran's consultants as well. So that is also in process to have that work done.
I mean, I asked that question because obviously at the public hearings that we've had to date, that the issue of groundwater and surface water has been a major consideration, I think, for neighbors, and that concern was underscored at our most recent site visit on a lovely Saturday morning, where we really exhaustively toured the site. At least I was exhausted when we finished. And again, it seemed like the overarching issue that was raised by many of the abutters and neighbors was the concern for surface water impacts and groundwater impacts, which, you know, for the most part, you could see firsthand as you walked around the site. I mean, there's a lot of water above ground and below ground. at this site, as there is in many spots throughout Milton, but I think it's a significant concern, and one that I think I'm hopeful will be addressed. And it sounds like you have some additional study and work in progress, and we'll look forward to hearing about what that one is concluded.
Yeah, that's right, Chairman Hurley. We're very much aware that this is a major interest of concern for the neighbors and for the community and for the town's peer reviewers and Attorney Corcoran's consultants. So we're aware of the issues and are working through those and very much take them seriously as a matter of high importance for this site.
So if I understand sort of the plan or the progression here, is that once we conclude this evening's hearing, the idea is that there would be another meeting among peer reviewers to further discuss some of the issues, and that as a consequence of that further meeting, that you guys would undertake to do some additional groundwater, surface water study, et cetera, going forward.
Yeah, that's right. As I believe Mr. Cordero discussed at the previous meeting, Chairman Hurley, the groundwater mounding analysis that was requested to be done, it's important to do it really only after the final design and layout and grading and all that is finalized. So we're in the process of making arrangements to get a firm under retainer to do that work. But it's really, we need to have a final design in mind for them to assess in terms of actually conducting that analysis. So
understood. So they have to know what they're evaluating.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anything further that the folks wanted the board to know going forward?
I believe that's it from our end, Chairman Hurley. I think based on what we've done in the past couple of weeks, I think if we came back in 2 weeks, I think that would probably be enough time to have a meeting with the peer reviewers, provided they have availability sometime next week, hopefully. And then hopefully by that time we'll be able to come back to the board and with a more definitive report and let you know what further documents we need to file. But I think, you know, from an engineering standpoint, there's not major changes that probably need to be made on this with respect to the drainage. Just based on this redesign, because as Tim mentioned before, the impervious area on the site is being slightly reduced on this plan.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I should open it up to any other comments from anybody who cares to comment.
The chair, I have a number of comments, if I may.
Sure, Mr. Corcoran, happy to hear from you this evening.
Thank you. My initial comment, just looking at what I'm looking at, is I don't see a whole lot of change. And I think one of the significant issues that came out in the consultant meeting was a significant concern expressed by Mr. Reardon about the use of porous pavement as the means by which they were going to manage stormwater. I think he thinks it's going to fail. And I think he asked that the engineers come back with an alternative approach. I'm not sure they were prepared to do that, but I think that's a significant concern that needs to get resolved, because the issue of managing water and stormwater goes way beyond the concerns of the neighbors. It's a major concern here. I think it's a concern all the way around. One of the things that we heard was that in order to install pervious pavement with their new stormwater system, that they would have to introduce 30,000 cubic yards of net new fill to the property. That's on top of thousands of cubic yards that would have to be removed from the first foot or so of ground level, and the volume needed to replace that. Then 30,000 cubic yards of new fill, plus all sorts of other materials. Our analysis shows that 30,000 cubic yards is equivalent to slightly more than 1,500 semi-tractor trailer loads. That's an enormous traffic impact on a very constrained section of Canton Avenue. I think the board should request the applicant to produce a construction management plan, at least with respect to trucking and traffic that would get at the following: the total number of trucks, the total volume of materials to be removed from the site and replaced, and the number of trucks necessary to remove and replace that volume. Confirmation that 1,500 plus or minus trucks is the appropriate number to deal with respect to the 30,000 cubic yards of net new fill. The total number of trucks necessary to bring gravel and other materials to the site relative to the build out of the roadway, asphalt, concrete, etc. I also understand that, there are, at least in the last plan, there were 13 buildings. And we think the average number of concrete mixers that would have to come to the site would be 18 per building relative to the amount of concrete necessary to pour concrete slabs, footings, and foundations. What's the number of trucks? Number of trucks necessary to deliver all mechanical equipment, all other utility materials, pipes, conduit, underground detention systems. What's the time frame over the course of, is it 6 months, 18 months, 12 months, 24 months for construction? What's the average number of trucks to be received on a daily basis and on a weekly basis? And I would ask the board to request that the peer review traffic engineer evaluate the traffic impacts of all of that traffic for the period of time during construction. The traffic report only deals with the traffic conditions post occupancy. It doesn't deal with all of the impacts associated with with traffic on Canton Avenue during construction, affecting the neighborhood. I'd like to know how they intend to clean the trucks when they leave the site, so that, and what the impacts physically to Canton Avenue might be. I think that would be of interest to Chase Berkeley and his staff at the DPW to know what kind of impact that volume of trucks might have on the road surface on Canton Avenue, as well as relative to introducing that volume of trucks during what we know to be 3 congestion peak periods of traffic: morning, afternoon, and after school. So I think that's important information for the board to have, and for the board's peer reviewer to review on your behalf. I do have other comments. I have George Tagayas, who has prepared a memo to the board relative to construction impacts, and Sean Fahey, who is the owner and president of Construction Management and Budget, a regional cum national construction management firm. Mr. Fahey is is not an abutter, but he lives in Indian Cliffs. He's an expert in construction management. He has some real concerns about the constructability issues facing this site, facing neighbors, facing the town. And if the board is appropriate for the board tonight, I'm happy to present both, or we can select another time the board might determine. But I think one of the fundamental questions, getting back to the start of my comments, is what's the stormwater management plan? I think way back at the start, we heard Cliff Bomer say that in a suburban setting, we do an analysis of the ground and then hand it to the architect. Seems to me they've taken a plan and handed it to the architect and asked the architect to spread buildings around, but they haven't done any analysis of the ground, what the ground can hold, and how much development the ground can hold. In fact, in that regard, I think the board should ask its consultants to push back on the developer to arrive at a buildable project. This is still too much, and I think the impacts are too significant. There's a project here. I've said that to Mr. Schomer privately. It's not this project. This is too much. It's too big. There are too many buildings massed on the edges of my client's property. They pulled away from Holmes Lane, but they've dumped it all on top of the Kellys, who abut whose property the stream comes through, and they've dumped it on to Beth Janiga's property, who abuts 652. They've shifted from one squeaky wheel and now it looks like they're coming after the other. I don't think that's fair. I think there's a project here that the circulation looks better, but it should be improved. But the real issue here is managing stormwater, and there's too much on this site to adequately manage stormwater and to manage constructability with respect to the site. So those are my comments. As I said, George Tagayas and Sean Fahey are prepared to speak tonight, if appropriate. I request the opportunity for them to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schumer, did you want to respond to any of that?
Not specifically tonight, Chairman Hurley. We appreciate the feedback from Attorney Cochran and his clients. We're very much aware that this is going to be an active construction site for an extended period of time, and I think it's fair to say that there will be construction impact on the neighbors, and we're not trying to sweep that under the rug. I think the suggestion of a construction management plan is something that we'll take into consideration. We know that in the past, I believe Mr. Reardon has requested the same thing be filed for this project. So, these issues are, again, something that we're very much aware of and we're taking into consideration on this project. But that having been said, thank you, Attorney Cochran, for the comments.
I guess my
as part of the sort of the ongoing work, would your clients, you think, Mr. Schumer, have a willingness to have a sort of construction traffic study done to see what this looks like it's going to be a long process, just from a layman's point of view, for this construction to go forward. I don't have any way to know one way or the other what the numbers are. I've heard Mr. Corcoran's numbers, and I can't really comment on them, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot of trucks, and it's going to have a lot of impact over and above what the impact would be from the people that lived in this project when it's completed. It's a different kind of impact. And I just wonder if your client would be willing to undertake a traffic study that would consider the construction period traffic impacts of the vehicles that will be necessary to build this site.
That's another one, Chairman Hurley. I would take that under advisement. I'd speak with our traffic consultant about what sort of a study like that would entail, because it obviously when Attorney Cochran mentions 1,500 vehicle trips or thereabouts, that sounds like a lot, obviously, and I don't mean to discount that, but that would be over an indeterminate amount of time and specific time windows. So when we have the traffic impact of a project like this studied, it's really for a bit of a different purpose than something like this would entail. So based on that, I would want to speak with our traffic consultant to see if that's something he could put together with some, based on some assumptions about how many trucks and the overall period of time.
My one comment to that, Mr. Chair, would be that 1,500 trucks would equate to 3,000 trips. Each maneuver is a trip in the transportation parlance.
That's right.
Okay. I mean, I realize that it's not the typical traffic study, but again, I think it would be helpful for us to know what kind of impacts you're going to be unleashing here on the neighborhood and on Canton Avenue as a result of all these trucks. But I understand your point. You're going to take it under advisement. But I think the board would find it helpful. Mr. Corcoran, I suggest that you have your two individuals who have information to share with the board. I think we might as well do it tonight since we're here.
May I ask that and back take the screen down so I can see whose hands are up? Thank you.
And the two people I would ask to be raised to panelists for that purpose would be George Tagayas and Sean Fahey.
Okay. Can you do that, Bev?
I sure can.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, just before we move on to this, I just wanted to make one comment, if that's all right, regarding the construction traffic. So first, Joe Tamposi with Comprehensive Land Holdings. Thank you to the board and the members of the public for tonight. And then second, so regarding the construction traffic, I think Jesse makes a good point. One, that this is not a permanent condition that's being created. It's a temporary construction period over a period of, several months to, perhaps 18 months. And so it's a temporary impact that creates permanent affordable housing for the town of Milton. And then secondly, regarding the construction trucks specifically, those trips typically occur during off-peak hours. So, the traffic impact is less. It's not like you have trucks coming in at, 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning during, the highest traffic hours. That would be managed during the construction process and with the construction manager on the project to make sure that those trucks are arriving and leaving at appropriate times and scheduled times.
Okay, I appreciate those points. And I appreciate that it's temporary, but if it's going to take 18 months and you're going to have hundreds of huge trucks going in and out, to the people that live nearby, that can be a tough 18 months. Anyway, I think Mr. Schoen said that there'll be some consideration given to a traffic study that focuses on sort of the construction period, and you'll get back to us on that. So, but thank you for those comments. So we've elevated the two folks to the dais, and Mr. Corcoran, I'll have you can put on whoever you'd like.
Thank you. I think we'll start with George Tagayas. I would just, we're teeing up this is a section of Canton Avenue that serves two public schools, the high school and middle school. And so obviously student safety relative to the volume, that new volume of traffic would be important to pay attention to. But I would start with George Tagayas, please.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Tagayas, the floor is yours.
Hi, good evening. I do want to reiterate.
George, you're muted.
You're muted.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Oh, it's a different George that's muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right, I agree with Mr. Corcoran in that the site still shows a high intensity of use. The architect did note that dumpster locations and snow locations and other things are still not shown on the plan, but there are a tremendous amount of problems that occur when you bring in 30,000 cubic yards of fill, and most likely even more. Because in talking with a geotechnical engineer, they're not just going to come in and add fill to the site. The construction team would need to come in and strip down probably a couple feet of organic material and then import clean fill onto the site. And one of the things that we were recommending, and Mr. Chair, I noticed you didn't mention two neighbor memos that were submitted since the last meeting. One is this October 18 memo that I'm referring to now, but there was also a legal neighbors memo that was submitted regarding the Mergewood access lane. I don't know, Tim or Judy, Ms. Barrett. I don't know if you got those to the ZBA in time, but those were two additional neighbor memos that I did not hear the chair mention.
They may have been filed. I personally don't recall having seen them, but we'll certainly find them.
Okay, so
we did receive those, and those are up on the website. They should be up on the website, and they should have gone out to the board. If they haven't, we'll double check that in the morning. I'm almost positive that they did.
They did.
All right, I appreciate that. So I'm speaking to the October 18 memo. Ned addressed stormwater and groundwater concerns. Intensity of use is still a major issue for us. As I understand that the site is still being raised, the 30,000 cubic yards is still raising the site anywhere from 3 to, I think, 9 feet at its maximum point. A lot of the edges require, I believe civil drawings are showing 1-to-1 slopes, which I'm not even sure is, that's a very unstable slope to have it 1-to-1. 2-to-1, 3-to-1 is recommended, but the end result is when you raise something that high, you take a neighborhood's natural grade and you raise it that high, you're going to end up dumping water on abutters. And one thing, if I could mention to the design team, is that when I was looking at your plan, I didn't see the 658 Janiga residence or the 654 residents, REPA residents across the street. It would be helpful to show those in the proximities because they're greatly impacted. 654 by the road, the new, the Mergewood access, emergency access lane. And 658 has steep grading that's going to be dumping potentially stormwater onto it. So if you folks wouldn't mind showing those in the future, that would be great. One thing I wanted to point out was a couple of life safety issues. When you evacuate a building for fire reasons, you're required to provide the occupants with an accessible means, and that is defined as a continuous and unobstructed way of egress travel from any accessible point in a building or facility to a public way. That would probably mean Canton Avenue. Mergewood Lane is a private driveway, unlit, very narrow. So that I don't think would be very safe. But the issue about providing a accessible means of egress is that Canton, the roadway, at least in the last scheme, going from about the middle of the site down to a little bit before Canton Avenue, the grade was 7.5%. As you may know, a sidewalk slope is 5% or less, and that's what defines a sidewalk. Anything greater than that is a ramp. So what I wasn't seeing on the plan was a series of ramps getting you down to Canton Avenue. Maximum grade of a ramp is 8.3%. I believe it's 1 in 12. Maximum length is 30 feet, at which point you would need a landing and then another ramp and a landing and another ramp. And that's how you would make your way down that access drive from Canton Avenue. You would need 2 sets of rails on both sides of the ramp, one for a wheelchair occupant, another for a standing pedestrian. So it does not make for a good design to have that feature on the site. The site is too steep and doesn't meet egress code. Now, if the access road down to Mergewood Lane is to be used, that's currently at 14%. That's going to be very difficult, especially with, it looks like townhouses, or at least in the old scheme, townhouses flanking it on either side. You would need a switchback ramps multiple times to negotiate that steep slope. So that doesn't meet the egress life safety code either. Now, when you get to emergency access vehicles, the National Fire Protection Association, they require a no greater access road of 1 in 20. That's 5%. Again, basically sidewalk grade or slope. So even the access point going up from Canton Avenue does not meet the NFPA. I don't know if the fire department has been broached on that subject or not. The access point going up from Mergewood to the site is about 7 feet and 50 feet or so, plus or minus. That's the 14%. I don't even think a regular vehicle could get up that slope in winter conditions. That to me seems, again, not meeting the NFPA, not meeting life safety egress. So those are two issues in the design that would need to get fixed in some capacity. As I mentioned, the building code requires a geotechnical study for this type of development. And it should be done during this phase so that issues can be addressed in the site design phase, especially with fluctuating water levels. A maximum slope of 3 to 1 is recommended. The plans do show 1 to 1 and 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1. And as I mentioned, constructing on this much fill would still require the removal of approximately 2 feet of organic material. And that's true of roadways, parking areas, stormwater, and buildings. I guess I'll let Sean address the construction issues. So I will turn it over to him.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good evening, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you, Sean.
My name is Sean Fahey, and I live at 202 Old Farm Road. As Ned said, I'm not in a butter, but I am very close to the development. First, I'd like to introduce myself for the purposes of explaining my career background. I do lead a construction firm, and I have 35 years of experience in building and site development. The name of my company is Construction Management and Builders. And my experience includes large site development projects throughout New England, New York, and New Jersey. And as a result of that, I've had to contend with water, with rock, with unsuitable soil, and various geotechnical issues on many projects. Typically, we run about 20 projects at one time. So I have the opportunity of exposure to many challenging conditions. So with that background, I thought it would be appropriate, Mr. Chair, to provide, to you and to the board members and to whomever else is listening. I do want to go back to the point that Mr. Corcoran was making in terms of the volume of fill, and I know the applicant commented on it as well. This calculation is a very easy calculation, 30,000 cubic yards. Allen and Major can run this calculation themselves. And the number that Mr. Corcoran mentioned earlier of 15 to 1,600 truckloads is only for the import of that 30,000 yard volume that's been stated. That is an unusual amount of fill to be brought to a site, and it is a task on a project development like this in terms of sequence of work. It is not going to be spread out over time. It's going to have to happen at the very beginning of the project. So as Mr. Tagaya said, the first thing that's going to happen is the site will get stripped of the organic material. Actually, first, before that, it will be cleared and grubbed, basically removing the brush and removing the trees, then the organic material, and then there'll be, and it needs to be rapid. If it's not rapid, the builder is not going to have a successful schedule. So there will be a concentrated effort to get that 30,000 cubic yards onto that site and in place. Now, I've lived in Milton my entire life. I don't think I can recall a project in Milton that has ever had that volume of trucking on any of our roadways. So, and I'm sure there's plenty of people in the town of Milton that have been around for as long as I have, and they would probably agree with that. So it is a magnitude that is very, very significant, and that's not even to consider, as Mr. Corcoran said, the activities of trucking that will be related to building construction. So whether it be concrete mix, asphalt, framing material, there's a tremendous impact on the neighborhood. And the point that you had made earlier, Mr. Chair, to require the applicant or request of the applicant to prepare a construction management plan, I would support that entirely, because this is not a typical construction project, notably because of this condition that the site has requiring such a platform to be built in the 30,000 cubic yards. The project has a very, very complicated and difficult site condition with constraints that are enormously challenging. And almost any development on this site is difficult. And notably, the larger the development, the greater the challenge. The comments that Ned Corcoran had mentioned earlier, you will find many of those in Ken Roach's outlined memo that he had submitted, Mr. Chair. And it's Allen and Major, and they're a very, very well-respected firm, but an engineering firm cannot change the conditions that exist. They can only develop the potential alternatives to mitigate, and even the best of firms can't design to overcome some of the situations that exist. So the applicant and I think the consultant group, they've presented a project that is, in my opinion, it has yet to prove that they have a well thought out approach to the project, especially with respect to the stormwater management, the preservation of trees, and the implications of importing the 30,000 yards of fill material, which happens to create some pretty dramatic challenges with grading transitions. So I'd like the board to recognize the commitments and the promises of the applicant have not yet been tested by a contractor. And I'm absolutely confident that when the project as presented, this one that is presented right now, when it is considered by a contractor, I'm confident the viability and the cost of the project will change dramatically. At that point, I guess the applicant will change their consideration of the project, but we shouldn't get to that point without a better development plan. And I think this is really the point that Mr. Corcoran has made. I think the reality is that the project hasn't had a contractor's perspective. And I'm not suggesting that a contract, that obviously I'm providing perspective from a contractor, but the applicant having a contractor with them, I think would put the board in a position where they would have enough of a comprehensive approach to a project that would allow you to see, you know, if the issues that have been raised can be mitigated by a contractor and make some of the red flags, you know, reach a resolution. So I guess in closing, I'd urge the board not to move a project forward that has such significant open engineering issues. Rather, I urge the board to require the applicant to address the concerns in a comprehensive manner. And really, this really means a sufficient geotechnical exploration, something that would allow the board to recognize as a result of a sufficient geotechnical exploration that they eliminate some of the concerns that have been tabled. I'm glad to answer any questions, Mr. Chair, if you have any, but I think if the applicant is required to do so, I think not only would the board be serving best the residents of the town, but I actually think it'd be serving the best interests of the applicant by doing so.
Let me just ask you, are you suggesting that we require a construction management plan now?
I am. I'm suggesting that you require that now, and I'm also suggesting that you require a sufficient geotechnical exploration of the site to determine the conditions that exist, rather than speculate what the site conditions actually are.
Is it, excuse my ignorance on this point, but is it unusual to do a construction management plan that's sort of this early in the process, or is it fairly typical?
Well, no, I don't think it is unusual. I think there is sufficient information available for the applicant to be able to do that. You know, a trucking exercise of 30,000 cubic yards, Mr. Chair, is not a, it is something that's easily understood. That is not a complicated task for anyone to understand. The nature of clearing and grubbing that site, and also removing the volume of organics, that also is not a complicated task. You know, combined, the effort, if they had developed some geotechnical information, and yes, it is It is conducting test pits up on that site, potentially borings on that site, so that the civil engineer is afforded a very, very comprehensive understanding of the soil condition that's up there. Once they have that, the construction management plan is going to be, it'll be much more possible. And it's just not that difficult, Mr. Chair.
And is that the sequence that you would do the geotechnical first, and then armed with
Yes.
that information, then you would do the
Yes.
construction management plan?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay, thank you very much. It's helpful. Ned, is there anyone else that you wanted to present this evening?
No, that was it. And I just would echo and highlight maybe one issue that you asked and Sean was addressing, and that is, without really understanding what the ground conditions are and what the real construction issues are, it's hard to develop a cost analysis for this project. And cost is a significant component at the end of the day, because one reason why they may be requesting a certain number of units may go to the fact that they have to mitigate the significant cost of construction. This is an enormously expensive project, the way it is currently contemplated. And I think that cost is maybe driving a component of unit count. It strikes me that the consultants ought to be looking hard at that, and they ought to be looking hard at what is the all-in budget here, because how do we net out a project that fits on the ground, that doesn't overwhelm the site? I mean, this notion, just to highlight this, the last project, the last iteration talked about a plinth with buildings on top. This is an earthen plinth. This is 7 feet plus or minus, particularly on the edges of the property with buildings on top. There's a geotechnical analysis that has to go into that to understand the bearing capacity of the soils, both existing soils and the new soils, in order to be able to withstand the load of 13 new buildings, plus parking area, plus driveways, plus. There's a lot there that has to be evaluated, and I agree with Sean that the starting point is a sophisticated geotechnical analysis and a construction management analysis, so that all of the impacts are understood and can be priced. They have to be priced by a contractor working for the developer, and the developer needs to take that in. Most developers would take that into account when they develop their site plan, because they want to make sure that they end up with a site plan that is actually buildable and doable.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else that wants to share any information with the board this evening?
Chairman Hurley, after the public comment period, if I may, we would like to have our civil engineer, Phil Cordero, be admitted to the meeting to offer some responses. We
Okay.
appreciate the feedback here, and we appreciate the opinions of Mr. Fahey and Mr. Tugayas, but I think there's been some misstatements that have been made, and I think it's important to clear those up for the record.
Okay, let me see if there's anyone else that has information for us, and then we can get to that gentleman.
I believe Mr. Tagayas is on again.
Okay.
Actually, it's Cheryl Tagayas, if I may.
Okay.
Cheryl Tagayas, 660 Canton Avenue. I just wanted to add on the truck traffic and the impact on Canton Avenue, that this is a school zone at this location because Milton High School is there. And I would think that there would be a safety concern about students walking. Normal construction hours would be 7 to 3. 3 o'clock is going to coincide with the release of school. So I do think it's important to look at that construction management plan and the truck traffic with respect to school safety. And then on the fill, I just wanted to add compacting of fill. I'm an architect, I've been an architect for 30 years, and I've worked with a lot of geotechnical engineers on our projects. And we know that 7 feet of fill requires it to be done in layers, and it requires it to be compacted. And we're talking about this being done very close to property lines, as I've pointed out. And in fact, since the last meeting, I submitted a letter with an accompanying attachment that shows the locations of the fill that I was referencing in terms of the 5 to 7 feet of fill near the property lines. And the other impact this has is that there are neighbors' trees and stone walls right on the property line or right next to the property line. And when you put that level of fill and you compact that soil, it's going to have a very negative impact on those neighbors' trees. And the neighbors shouldn't have to not only lose all the trees on the adjoining property, but lose trees on their own property due to this construction. So I think it's really important to look at that site plan and look at the proximity of the buildings and the fill relative to the property lines and the neighbors. And this site plan that we saw tonight has very, very minor changes in that regard. And I think that, that the peer review architect and the engineer recognize this issue as well. And I would suggest that prior to the next working session, that the architect take a hard look at these particular issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Scott Horsley.
Okay.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Scott Horsley, working with Ned Corcoran. Just one comment, Mr. Chairman, regarding the testimony tonight regarding the geotechnical analysis requirement, which I fully agree with. I was part of the consultants meeting that you suggested last week, and we had a good discussion. I'm very happy to hear the applicant has committed to doing the groundwater mounting analysis, because I believe that's going to be critical. Frankly, I think that in my mind, that should go to a prerequisite to designing the site rather than designing the site first and then doing the groundwater mounting analysis. In my experience, working with site design, this is an iterative process. So I think that's going to be important. And my specific comment is, during that session, we talked about the fact that the applicant has installed a number of monitoring wells in some of the test pits that they have added to the site. And I asked if they would be measuring water levels, and I think the answer was no. And I would like to suggest, as in a follow-on to the need, I think everybody's in agreement this is a challenging site. More data is better. We have wells on the site. Some of the early test pit data shows an 8-foot fluctuation in water levels seasonally, which is significant. So it strikes me, Mr. Chairman, that if we have wells in place on the property, that some additional water level measurements, I would suggest monthly, it's very easy to do, would be really helpful in the site design. So that would be my one suggestion for your consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Worsley. Anyone else?
No.
Okay. Mr. Shore, floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Hurley. Could I ask that Phil Cordero be admitted as a
Oh,
panelist?
sorry. Yes.
Sure,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
Just a minute, please. Here he is. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you.
Mr. Cordero, happy to hear from you.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to jump in as a panelist. What my goal here tonight would be, I don't want to get into too many technical weeds, but I think for the benefit of the board, before things get too much traction, I think I have to provide just some clarifying points to make sure that the board doesn't walk away with a sense of that we haven't considered a lot of these elements that some of the abutters and the professionals have brought up. And I'll start by saying, I will defer, of course, to the professionalism of Mr. Tagayas and Ms. Tagayas and Sean Fahey in their respective professions. But a lot of the items that I think the way they presented it this evening really creates a sky is falling scenario and a worst case prediction of the situation out on the site. So I think the first thing that I'd like to bring up is the number of fill has been really tossed around this evening quite haphazardly, and the number is about 30,000 yards. And while I'm not discounting the number, and I'm not discounting the calculations that were provided to the board, relative to how many trucks that would take and the yardage per truck and the timing. The 30,000 yard is really an all-in value, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. And what I mean by that is it's the estimation to take the existing grade from where it is now to the proposed grade. So within that cross-section is not only import fill material, but it's concrete for foundations that Attorney Corcoran made reference to. It's the drainage field, our envelopes for stormwater collection underneath the pavement. It's the pavement itself. It's the gravel. It's the foundation walls for the building, the sidewalks, the loom. All of those numbers are embedded in that average 30,000 yards. Now, why is that important? It's important not as a net number, but as everybody refers to the construction management plan, there's a sequencing of events that happen. We don't build the site instantaneously. It would be great if we could, but we can't. We obviously would need to start by bringing in import material. We would then bring in drainage. We would then bring in some concrete for one of the buildings in a phasing order that benefited the site in the right construction management sequencing. And then we would bring in gravel for pavement, et cetera, on and on. The point of the story is we would do it in a phased approach where it's not 30,000 yards tomorrow. It's a few trucks this week, it's a few trucks today, it's a few trucks tomorrow. It's over the course of the entirety of the project, sequenced differently, certainly reflective of the traffic that occurs on Canton Avenue, certainly reflective of the traffic at the adjacent intersections, certainly reflective of basic safety parameters for school-age children, pedestrians, et cetera. That's all part of the program. And I wouldn't want the board to walk away with the sense that we haven't considered that and we wouldn't consider that in greater detail. Other elements that came up in the conversation, and these are in no particular order, just as I was taking notes, and in no particular assignment to any of the previous speakers, but there was discussion regarding the fire code. There was discussion regarding the NFPA. And there was some mischaracterization as to the application of code. Fire access roadways under the NFP code are allowed to go up to 10%, unless specifically allowed by the fire department having jurisdiction. So in this case, the Milton Fire Department. If they felt the grade was appropriate for the vehicles that they utilize in their emergency rescue operations, they could approve the plan therein abiding with the NFPA code. So the idea that all roads always and forever need to be 5% or less is a misnomer. That can be worked out with the fire chief. The same is also true with the application of an ADA code. There are many different layers of the ADA code and ancillary codes that run along with it. Not only federally, but here at the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board level and at the federal level. And really what's baked into all of those is a series of standards. But in certain cases, those standards cannot always be met. And like with most rules, there are exceptions to the rules that if the conditions warrant, you do not need to meet certain aspects. So not all sidewalks are 5% across the universe or across Massachusetts. So therein lies the opportunity to create sidewalks that can exceed certain grades without the need for providing ramps. Now, the elements that the gentleman put forth regarding ramps, maximum grade, landing areas, railings, those are certainly seem to be correct, but the applicability of ramp in a general sense is not appropriate here. We also talked a lot about geotechnical exploration, and certainly that is in fact warranted not only as part of what I do under the site design, but ultimately under the foundation design for the buildings. And those are done, those reports, that testing is done in due course with any project. So at this stage, we've done a series of preliminary testing on the site. We've done deep hole testings, both ourselves from Allen and Major were present, but certainly DeSelberg Solar, our predecessors were on site. And we are not representing ourselves as geotechnical
I'm
engineers.
sorry, have you completed?
Hello? Oh. Am I still on? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I apologize. It just stuttered on my end.
Okay.
But I just have a couple more points, Mr. Chairman, then I'll wrap up. Regarding the geotech, we've done preliminary exploration, but additional work is required to design the foundations. Typically, that is engaged as the project commences. It's not often front-loaded as maybe the construction manager had pointed out. We want to get a confirmation that the project is viable and likely, and then we proceed in additional testing to support the foundation design. Mr. Horsley also pointed out, and we discussed this at the site walk regarding the water levels on site. There are monitoring there are monitoring wells that were installed by DeSalle Burke during their test pit analyses. We have not been monitoring those, so those are a true statement. But the fluctuations that Mr. Horsley is referring to, we established groundwater elevations on the site using features in the soil, redoxymorphic colorations in the soil, the high groundwater as most people refer to. It's a standardization that we have to follow for establishment of groundwater relative to drainage and septic investigations. That has been done, that has been confirmed, and everything that we're doing is based off of those elevations, which are very near the ground surface, as this board is aware. Monitoring, while I also agree more data is better than less data, we don't believe we'd have productive data coming out of there. The water level is not going to be deemed higher than what we've observed through all of the test pits across the site. In closing, what I really want to stress to everybody is the idea of a construction management plan is also part of the process. It's part of the evaluation of any site once we advance through the design phase. At this stage, we are still very much fluid in the design, as Embark pointed out under the initial presentation. We are responding and reacting to comments in real time. And once all of those comments are taken under advisement, then that's the best opportunity for us to really evaluate the site in full context of the needs and necessity of the site. The last point, Mr. Chairman, is I just want to make sure, and I'm happy to elaborate if anybody has any further questions regarding the applicability of code, how it's applied, how it's reviewed. But we need to just follow those as opposed to just putting out some pretty baseless accusations as to why things need to be a certain way without really providing the background data associated with them. So we look forward to seeing the letters that were referred to at the onset of the hearing this evening. We look forward to seeing those and seeing the comments as written out. We don't have the luxury of having seen those as of yet, but we'll be on the lookout for those. Thank you.
I think they're all part of the public record. I'm sure that Bev can help you with that.
Yeah. You can reach
let me
out.
ask you a question though. So what you're essentially saying is it's premature to do a geotechnical study and or a construction management study because you haven't finalized sort of the project, if you will, what the project is going forward. So, and I understand that, but understand our situation, you would be asking us to approve a project without having had the benefit of that construction management plan or that geotechnical study, which I think is a difficult thing to ask this board, given, I mean, the reality is you don't have to be a rocket scientist to go out and look at that site and say, wow, this is a challenge here. There's water all over the place, above ground, below ground. This is it's a challenging site. And it's in a difficult location on a main street in Milton with schools and town hall and the whole bit. And it just strikes me that it would be somewhat irresponsible for the board to approve a project without having the benefit of that geotechnical study and the construction management plan before we unleash hell on the town. I mean, I think it'd be irresponsible for us to do that. So I guess what I'm saying to you is whenever you get to the point that you think you've done all that you can do in terms of designing the project as a result of these meetings with consultants, wouldn't it be appropriate then at that point to do the geotechnical study and do the construction management plan and present it to us before we take action on the application?
Well, your point, Mr. Chairman, is certainly well taken, and I understand it from the perspective of the town. And again, under the notion that more data is certainly better than less, as I've mentioned and Mr. Horsley mentioned. Historically, in terms of order of operations, as I mentioned, we do preliminary testing. You pursue the project at a permitting level to reinforce that it is a viable project, and then you advance it into final detail testing, certainly well before construction. It is uncommon to do a full geotechnical exploration at this stage of a project, quite frankly, in terms of the ones that we work on. Now, on the construction management front, that's a little bit different. We have been involved with, and certainly our team will take it under advisement as we leave here this evening, provided additional construction level details in terms of order of operations, estimated trips, et cetera, as discussed here this evening. I don't think that would be out of the realm of possibility. And if it benefited the board, I think certainly the team, I certainly don't want to speak for the owner. He can reflect upon that on his own behalf. But providing pertinent details as to how the site would be organized and managed, at least at this stage. See, part of the challenge is any development team group, certainly the ownership group, wants to have a construction team on board, wants to be consulted with them. So we are putting forth the known team that will be involved, the actual facts that will be involved with that group. We don't have that team engaged yet. We're still obviously in permitting with the project. So we can put together pertinent details, but they would be with an asterisk that they would be revised and revisited when we have an actual construction manager engaged on the project. So the short answer to your question, construction management plan, we have done so at a permitting stage. Geotechnical, to do the full-blown investigation, it would be atypical at this early stage, Mr. Chairman.
Understood. Well, I trust that your team will discuss these points after this evening, and
Yes.
we'll take them up again at the next session. Is there anyone else that wants to present additional information this evening?
Ned.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of points in response. I heard very clearly in the consultant meeting that the 30,000 cubic yards we referred to net new fill, and that came from Mr. Cordero. So I think that needs to be clarified. I think that detailed information about volumes of material and timing of deliveries needs to be clarified and should be reviewed by the peer review consultants. Second request would be whether or not the fire chief has seen the grading plan for the proposed secondary access, egress, emergency access from Merdwood Road, and whether he would agree that a 14% slope is appropriate. Separately, I know that the issue of access to Merdwood remains out there. I know that the chair said at the site walk that it's likely that it's going to have to go to court. I'm just wondering, at what point or how the board sees itself handling that issue, or whether you think you'll simply condition any permit that might be issued on the applicant establishing completely that it has unfettered legal access to Merdwood Road for any purpose, including for emergency access.
My sense of this, and I encourage Mr. Brown and Mr. Davis to speak for themselves. I think I told you on the site walk, and I think it's quite clear that this board does not have either the authority or the capacity to make determinations as to whether or not a use of a particular easement overburdens that easement, which is essentially the issue that you're presenting. That's an issue for the Superior Court or the Land Court to decide. And I think the most that we could do, I mean, I think everyone agrees that secondary access would be a condition to a permit. I think the most we could do is to say that secondary access is a condition to the permit. You have to have it in order to get a building permit or whatever. I think we can clearly do that. And then how people deal with that issue is up to the applicant and up to the neighbors. But we're not in a position to adjudicate complicated real estate title issues.
That's fair. I appreciate your clarifying that point. Thank you.
Okay, well,
We had the Milton Garden Club.
I'm sorry.
Milton Garden Club has their hand up.
Sure.
I don't know who exactly.
We're happy to
that
hear from
is.
anybody who's here tonight that would like to speak.
Yep. I don't know exactly who it is, but
Okay, we'll find
there we
out.
go. Yep. Yep.
Hi,
Hello?
I'm sorry. This is actually Robin O'Neill at 30 Holmes Lane apart. I'm dealing with different Zoom issues. I apologize. My only comment is, and again, Chairman, I agree. Could we get a few more specific answers answered before the neighbors go along with this project? We're expected to just go ahead and say, yeah, this is great. But could we get a few more, like the geotechnical, the other thing? I mean, maybe this isn't the typical building project, but it certainly is the first one in our neighborhood in God only knows how much, forever and ever. Could we please get more answers before we go along and say this is great? That's all I have to say. Thank you.
I pretty much think I shared that sentiment with you in my questions. You can't ask this board to approve what is a complicated and impactful project without having all of the information that we need to make that decision. It's an important decision and we need to make an informed decision. So as much information as can be given to us that relates to the ground and what's going to happen during construction, so much the better. I think it's important that we have that information. So I'll leave it to the team to talk about these issues and report back at our next session.
Phil Cadero.
I'm sorry?
Phil Cadero. Am I on?
Okay.
Very, thank you, Beverly. Very quickly, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to state unequivocally to Attorney
I'm
Corcoran.
having trouble hearing you, Mr. Cordero.
I'm sorry, am I on?
You're on, but very faint, at least to me.
Oh, I apologize for that. I just wanted to state very clearly for the record the matter regarding the fill, if it was assumed differently by Attorney Corcoran, as I explained it here tonight, is the correct analysis. And the second point, Chief Madden at the fire department has seen the grading plans, and we are reviewing the grading on that emergency access road with him. So those were two questions raised. I just wanted to make sure we could resolve those very quickly.
I personally would find it very helpful at some session of this public hearing to have Chief Madden come in and speak to us via Zoom so that we can ask him all the questions we have. Obviously, fire safety is an important issue to this board. And I feel like I'm getting this information in piecemeal and secondhand and hearsay. I think it would be very nice to have the chief come and speak to us directly.
We can make those arrangements, Mr. Chair.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, Jesse, did you want to say anything or respond or suggest a path forward or all of the above?
Thank you, Chairman Hurley. The 40B permitting process, I think, is confusing for a lot of people, and it causes a lot of vexation because, at the same time, what we're proposing is larger than is permitted under the local zoning. And at the same time, the 40B statute provides that many of the regulatory processes that the town officials are used to applying in typical development are not applicable in the 40B process. So I understand that that's something of concern to the neighbors because the perception is that we're moving forward with a 180-day permitting period for something that's larger than would normally be allowed under the zoning bylaw, full stop. So we recognize that, and we're going to do our best to proceed through this process and assuage those concerns and address them. What I would urge everyone to keep in mind is that The permitting process does not end when the comprehensive permit for this project, if the board is inclined to approve one. The permitting process does not end when that is issued. There's a robust process after that happens where there's code review, compliance review for all state and federal codes and laws, which are applicable to this project just as they are to any other project that's developed in the Commonwealth. We're not allowed to obtain or request any waivers from any federal or state laws. And so any of these issues that we're talking about tonight about architectural access board requirements, about fire code, about fire safety, building code, all of those are applicable to this project, as are the state stormwater management standards. So I realize that it's not a great consolation to the neighbors tonight who are concerned and would like to see every concern of theirs addressed tonight and during this permitting process. But the reality is that during this, some of these issues will have to be left to conditions. And there are a number of appropriate conditions that we're working through now with the board's consultant and with the board's peer reviewers who are the same on this project as they are for the Blue Hill Avenue project, to create some appropriate language for conditions that would provide adequate safeguards for these kinds of issues and things like the construction management plan and things like the geotechnical analysis. So just to make sure everyone is aware, these are not issues that we've forgotten about. We're aware of them. They will be addressed during this process, not probably to the satisfaction of everyone during this process, but they will be addressed through the permitting process that takes place after this board's review is completed. I would additionally just like to remind everyone that this project is being peer reviewed by independent third-party consultants that are retained by the town at our expense. Mr. Reardon, Mr. Dirk, and Mr. Bomer are here for the town's benefit and the neighbors' benefit, and they're overseeing this project, and they will ensure that this project complies with all requirements and is safe and is livable for the neighbors. We understand that there are construction impacts that they're concerned about, and we're willing to address those to the extent we can during this process. But those will have to be addressed going forward. So with that having been said, Mr. Chair, I think we've got a couple of items to be looking into. I would propose, as I mentioned before, 2 weeks from tonight that we come back, and in the meantime, we work with the town's peer reviewers to set up a follow-up working session with them to discuss the revised plan that was shown tonight, and then come back to the board in 2 weeks with further details.
Okay, I mean, that Ted and Mike, is that acceptable to you fellows?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
November 2nd.
So we would set the hearing, Bev, for 2 weeks from today, whatever that date is.
November 2nd.
What is it? I'm sorry, November 2nd at 7 o'clock?
Yes.
Jesse, let me ask you this question. I've kind of gotten lost in this because of the way it's kind of progressed. Where are we in terms of timing? In other words, when do we need to close the public hearing? And then how long after we close the public hearing are we going to have to issue a decision?
So the date, I'm just looking at my calendar to see if I have that, Mr. Chair. I believe it's the second or third week in December when the public hearing date closure was extended to.
Okay.
And
The second week, Jesse.
Yeah. Oh, Judy, thank you.
thank you. So that would be, I believe, the 7th of December, Chairman Hurley. And then following that, the board would have 40 additional days to deliberate and issue a decision.
Okay, I'm sure I have that written down somewhere, but it just, as we were talking about dates, it just struck me, it'd be nice to revisit that. But thank you very much for that. Okay, well then that's what we'll do. We'll wait, we'll reconvene in 2 weeks and see where we are at that point. I urge everyone to do all that you can to meet as quickly as possible. I know there's been difficulties in the past in getting people together, but I think it's important that these meetings go forward quickly, and maybe, who knows, you may need to have 2 meetings in this 2-week period. I think the more meetings, the better.
Mr. Chair, if I may, given schedule, I I think we heard commitment to do groundwater analysis, groundwater mounting analysis. Will that be done before the close of the hearing? I think I think the other issues, big issues dealing with construction management, and geotechnical analysis associated with that, that's fundamental to how you develop a site. That information ought to be available to this board to consider. I think your comment was spot on with respect to your need to reevaluate that. And that material ought to be done and available to the board and the peer review consultants before this hearing is going to close.
I think that's something that Mr. Shorman is people are going to have to talk about after tonight. I mean, I think I've made our thoughts clear on that, and we'll get back to us as to what they're willing to do when we have the next session of the public hearing, but I'm not going to put them on the spot at the moment.
Thank you.
And any
Thank you.
question, any attendees, are we done with the Q&A and we will revisit this in 2 weeks, or
Okay.
we do have a hand up, but we can,
I'm not going to cut somebody off. If there's just one hand up, let's see who it is and what they have to say.
thank you. Denise, it's you.
Hi, this is Denise Crayley from 64 Old Farm Road. Can you hear me?
We
Yes.
can hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I just wanted to say that it was very helpful to hear from both sides this evening in regards to public safety in particular, which I'm very concerned about. And not to minimize what anybody has said, but I heard from the civil engineer, I heard from Sean Fahey in terms of 30,000 trips. So whether that's upfront or spread throughout the project, it's 30,000 trips. I'm sorry, did I say that right? 30,000? No, that's 30,000 units, so 3,000 trips, sorry. So, in terms of public safety, in terms of the students that are accessing, going in and out of the school, we also in our neighborhood, just to let you know, all the cross-country teams run around here. We have student driving that happens in this neighborhood all the time. So it's not just, going into school and coming out of school. It's a whole neighborhood that we need to consider in terms of what happens in this area, not just the schools. So I just want to make sure that that's taken into consideration, whether those 3,000 trips are up front or spread throughout 18 months or however long this project is taking. That's an enormous amount of traffic that's coming in and out of this neighborhood. So it's something that really needs to be considered very, very carefully. So that's all I had to say for this evening, but I thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
Appreciate your comments. Okay, Beverly, with that, I think we'll close the public hearing for tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll reconvene in 2 weeks
Okay.
and see where we stand.
Thank you,
All right.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. I thought it was a very good hearing tonight. We got some good information and good feedback from both sides, and I certainly found it helpful. I look forward to seeing you all or hearing from you all in 2 weeks.
Very good. Thank you.
Good night.